Hello there folks, this is Geraths here, and today we're going to be working on the shoulders, the arms, and the hands, but front view. And I'll be putting together 3 different drawings of 3 different models with 3 different forms of arms and sizes and shapes. So what I've done at this point is speed up the film 300% so you can see the process in a very quick manner. That way you can see the build-up of the whole gestural measuring process as I go along. You can see I'm putting in the anatomy right now, rib cage, pelvis, a little bit of the arm, kind of accenting where the elbows are. It's where the darker line is where things come to the surface. Kind of starting to build a little bit of form too, because I'm trying to combine all these different methodologies together in this preliminary drawing. So after blocking in all the general form and the landmarks, what I'm doing is I'm coming in and sort of measuring it. Now, if I'm writing a workshop or I'm doing longer drawings, I'll use this methodology. I'll certainly eyeball this stuff and put it all together, but those angle sights are really important in relationship to keeping everything together into a cohesive package. So as you put this together, make sure all those landmarks kind of line up. It's a good way, if you're drawing quickly, to sort of gauge the width to the height ratio where all the bigger forms kind of fit together. And what I'm doing right now is I got this diagram of the pec muscle out there. I'm going to go across the span, across the chest, from shoulder to shoulder, and from one edge of the rib cage to the other. In this part of the demonstration, what I'm doing is I'm adding the clavicles, and I'll be accenting the arm, the lower portion of the arm, and the elbow, showing again where it comes to the surface, but also bringing it forward in the drawing for atmospheric perspective. Now, I am drawing it a little bit hard and making this blue accent that I'll be getting rid of later, but this will give you a good idea of what the arm will wrap around, what it will attach to, and those muscle forms will add to those volumes. To me, those attachment parts are really important because that's where you're going to be stretching the muscle or drawing the combination of the straight lines with the curved lines, making those comparisons. You'll be sort of strapping the tendons onto the wrist and onto the hands. And in general, it'll bring much more of an accuracy and a believability to your design and your drawing. Now, one of the really important parts of this demonstration is as I block in the arms, you'll notice I don't really try to draw the arms. I just draw some general overall block out, some shapes, and then what I do is you can see those little lines I'm drawing across is what I'm doing is I'm comparing the width to the length of each one of these forms so it's believable. I'll put the curves and the musculature, the anatomy in later, but I want to make sure that I get everything in proportion first. So at this point, I just lay in those larger tubes, those bigger overlaps, so I can see again where one forms in front of the other, and where I'm drawing those ellipses are also, importantly, about where the major belly of the muscles, the larger part, or where the tendons are going to fit into the elbows or into the shoulder area. If I get confused about all the different muscles and things, that's an organizing principle. Those larger tubes just keep me on track about where all this stuff fits in, where the overlaps are, where the pressure points are, where the focal points are going to be. So now as we moved into this next step, you'll see I'll lighten up the drawing a little bit so I'll be able to fit those muscle forms in over the top of it. And I've got the diagram of the arm on the left-hand side. As you can see, it doesn't perfectly match it. If you really want to learn how to draw this, you have to take each one of those angles of the muscles that you'll probably get in books. This is from Baum's. The other ones are using it from Michael Hampton's book, is that you have to learn that 3-dimensionally so you can twist and turn those forms to be able to understand them and then apply them to your drawing. Now jump between the diagram and the arm, you'll see that I'm beginning to gesture in the muscle shapes, right? Not so much the form, it's just generally taking the diagram and applying that to the body that'll come up. We'll bring our reference up in a little while here. You might notice that I'm not drawing it with a really hard line, as I'm taking all those pieces and applying it to that bigger tube, that bigger design, and now starting to kind of add a little bit more organicness to it, a little bit more curves, a little bit more weight. That's where the darker line is. It's where the forms are underneath, away from the light. But in general, trying to make it all work together as one bigger form rather than let it cut into like little tiny diagramical pieces. I am moving into reinforcing some form because now I'm fanning out the line a little bit more on the edges, giving more of a softness around the core shadows. And you may notice that as I go into this, that when I block in a muscle form, what I do is I'll sort of twist the line around it, or curve a line, and that automatically gives the form an end, and it sort of inserts it into another volume. Also done a other little trick that I'll use here is that even though I use the anatomy books and the diagrams, that I'm not overly faithful for them in the fact that what I do is I'll change the pec muscles into waffles, the shoulder into like a cap or bicycle seat, or just simple tubes as I build this up so I can get more of a handle on the form, more handle on the difference between, say, the belly, soft part of the muscle, and the tendons that attach to other parts of the body. You see I'm accenting the shoulder right now and kind of bringing that bone a little bit more to the surface. It'll probably disappear a little bit later, but you can see how those accents sort of affect the atmospheric perspective and where you want the eyes to go or move through. It's important that you use the anatomy to sort of help your design and help build the form and what you want to do with it, right? How you want people to look at it. Not that you become a slave to it or it becomes a chart or a diagram. That it's there to enhance your bigger design than it is to break out into separate little pieces. Now's a real good time to look at that diagram of the arm and see how I apply it to the gesture and the proportions of the model, the way it's really working. Now as we work back to the reference photo of the model, you can see that I'm really beginning to put in more of the core shadows and trying to get the rhythm of them. So rather than kind of coloring it in, you can see my pencil moving from the outside to the inside of the form, from the contour to the core shadow, to the curves, to the straight lines, showing whether it's tendinous, like what I'm doing right now down the elbow, it's tendon area, or into the belly of the muscle, the line's a little bit more fanned out and a little bit more rounded. So now I'm really jamming on that core shadow. And again, the core shadow has been explained in my creative form videos from before. But what it basically is, it's the separation between the direct light hitting the arm and the shadowed area. And for demonstrational purposes, I probably drew this about 25% darker and deeper than I normally would, so it will identify on camera a little bit better. You can see it. But just make sure that you pay attention to that you don't want those lines to get too hard, sort of like you're putting stripes on a zebra or a tiger. Those overly hard lines sometimes can break apart your design and force the general overall bigger form into small pieces that perhaps you may not want. So as you can see, the model I'm using for this reference photo is very well developed, very strong, large muscles. The next drawing I'm going to be doing will be someone that has a lot more softer form, that you can hardly see any of these muscles, but they're all still in there and you have to kind of pay attention to that. So as I build this up, and you can see that sometimes I'm hitting the edges a little bit more harder. The core shadows, which is again the Terminator shadows, you can see a little bit of reflected light there as I put it in. I make sure that I fan that line out depending on the softness of the form, but I try to keep a rhythm going so you don't stop and start. That what happens is that you pick up the information, your eye keeps still roaming around the composition looking for information. I'm coming into about the last part of the drawing here, and sort of working up the hands a little bit more. I want the hands, especially the one that's grasping the pole, to be strong and to be able to look like it's actually holding something. So you see a combination of soft and harder lines, building up the knuckles. Again, we go back to that tubes again, the shapes of the fingers, trying my darndest to make the whole drawing cohesive and work as one mass so it doesn't fragment and confuse the viewer. Now in the process, I step back and kind of take a look at the entire form and bring in a kneaded eraser and soften up some areas. You can still see a lot of that structure underneath it. And then come in and strengthen some areas, soften some of the lines, come in with those shadow planes underneath the form to kind of pull everything, literally kind of sew all the subforms together. As you can see, I'm going to go across the arm, underneath, across, and then look at the comparison and the contrast between, say, the light on the pec underneath the arm, and then the trackway of the brachioradius muscle I'm working on there, the bicep, and then make the eye flow a little bit better. So last little pieces of icing on the cake, a little accenting of the form, some little bit of cross contour, little hatching marks, some reinforcing the rounder forms. As we close out, remember it's a demo drawing. Perhaps it's a little bit dark, a little bit chewed up, but you'll get the idea of this before we move on to our next drawing of a different model. So here's the next model. It's pretty obvious that she doesn't have the big muscle buildup our last model had for the drawing, but it's still all the same information. It's all the same muscles. It's all the same rib cage and pelvis and structural stuff. Now the line quality will change, and what will happen is that even though I've got this all sped up again to about 300% faster than normal, you'll be able to see the blocking in procedure and then moving into more of adding form to it. If you reference the information from the last drawing, you'll see that the process is virtually the same. The only difference is that I'm super simplifying it at this point, just because that the muscle groupings are not as dominant or not as important as when you're actually just drawing a real simple form on her. Now, I will be adding the muscles to it, muscle groupings to it, the accents of them, but not as hardcore as I did with the last drawing. Now, one big thing I have to admit is that I'm really pounding on the clavicles, which are those shoulders right there. And again, for demonstrational reasons, because I want you to see where that is under the form I'm going to draw later. It will affect the drawing in a little bit, but again, the most important part is you're going to be putting this to practice and seeing where that is, and then imagining where all those muscles are going to be attaching to those simple anatomical skeletal forms. Since there's not as much obvious muscle form here, what I'm doing is really simplifying those measurements. Just going for a real simple tube in between, say, the elbows and the armpits, the elbows and the wrist. Again, just to give myself an organization when I pose like this that may be a little bit more difficult to get a handle on. Make sure that it's unified. You might also notice that I made some changes in it to fit the composition of the page. Everything's still in proportion and everything still works. It's just that I've kind of moved stuff around a little bit. Raised an arm up, lowered an elbow down, made it work for me in relationship to this drawing. which frankly, if you're going to be in a workshop or you're going to be drawing on your own, you're going to be making those decisions frequently, so your design will fit your concept. I personally think that it's important that you take these processes, all of this anatomy, all of your design, and apply it to your outlook. So you will have to make minor adjustments and changes, and it's just so it'll work as a bigger design, as a bigger concept or statement of what you're looking at, rather than copying it like a photograph. At this point, I'm bringing in a couple of diagrams, one from Michael Hampton's book, to show you how the pec muscles, basically the muscles on the chest, the deltoids and the trap muscles, which are the blue ones on the shoulders, affect the entire drawing, and how you get a squash and stretch effect in it, where the curves accent where the forms are building up, and where the straight lines are where it's stretching or where there's more tendinous area. Okay, now time for less yakking and more drawing. So perhaps what during this demonstrational drawing here, the line got a little bit hard, so I came back in, took a kneaded eraser and sort of softened up a little bit. Yeah, the anatomical information is still a little bit too defined. It probably should be a little bit more softened, a little bit more. But what I am doing in here, as you can see, I'm using a little bit more side of the pencil, building up the core shadows a little bit more, trying to get sort of more of a rhythm and flow through the entire form, rather than concentrating on any specific muscle groupings. And once again, you'll see I'll make some readjustments. I'll soften some areas. I'll come back in, kind of readjust things, change the proportions a little bit, curve things out. And again, look for that visual rhythm and flow. You'll do this in workshops quite a bit, where you'll draw and you'll reassess, and then come in with a final concept at the end of your drawing. So for our third drawing and reference, I'm using an athletic woman as our model here. And also a very unique view, one that you usually don't get. It's like this sort of bending over, looking up, this sort of worm's eye view. And I'm simplifying the process a lot more. You can see I've sort of like really knocked down the tubes and knocked down the rib cage and the general structure of it, and simplifying it even more. In real time, this drawing took about 10 minutes. I've sped it up to twice the speed, 200%, again, just so you can work through the process. But you can see again how I'm taking the information from the previous two drawings and blocking it out with a lot of confidence and a lot of simplicity. So there is a rib cage in there, yes, there's shoulder blades in there, there's elbows in there, but again, I'm shooting much more for a finished result, considering I'm only going to have 10 minutes to get the entire thing done. One of the difficulties is mixing all this together. So I have a unique view looking up at the model. Proportions are kind of a little bit on the weird side. There's definitely not some of the traditional canon of measurements you can use. And I'm also shooting for a quicker result with a lot of different kind of anatomy in it. So you have soft tissue, rounded form. You're having those hard lines on the hands and where the tendons pop in. You can see where forms get big and then they sort of pounce down. They funnel down to a smaller area like in the armpits or up in the neck. And so what I'm having to do is wrestle or kind of juggle all these different aspects together, as well as kind of get the idea that I'm drawing for a certain amount of time, which if you're in a workshop drawing a model, is extremely important. You're only going to have a certain amount of time to get this information down, and your believability is going to be very super important in that. So it's going to have to be about the entire design rather than the pieces. Now I am juggling line and tone and anatomy, form, proportion, all these different components in putting this drawing together. And I'm laying in a little bit of a shadow pattern on it to see if I can kind of use that shadow going across the chest to hold it together. Now this really isn't a drawing about shading. I'll be demonstrating that in a video later. But at this point what it does, it helps gives me a contrast and it gives me a visual flow from one arm to the other arm. So I have put myself on a timer on this. I know I only have 10 minutes and I'm down to about the last minute and a half or so. I make the conceptual decision to go more with the linear aspect, which is what the focus of the demo is rather than the shading. The shadow is to sort of bring your eye across from one shoulder to the other, but it's more important that you look at the rhythm of the line going across these forms as we enter the end of the drawing. As we reach the end point of this last drawing here, take note of the information, and I put in a few of my own workshop drawings, class drawings, for you to take a look at and make a comparison, again, unhindered by the demonstrational part and just looking at it as pure drawing and the enjoyment of drawing in workshops environments. These workshop drawings are all the way from 15 minutes to 2 minutes long, and they show a good amount of different materials from ballpoint pens to pencils to colored pencils, and hopefully you'll be able to see the process in motion. So thanks again for visiting and watching, and if you get a chance, leave a comment or a big thumbs up, and hopefully you get the chance to take a look at the other videos. Thanks again. See you later. Bye.